Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Definitive Analysis. And today we will be covering, I think, probably Baldwin's most popular short story, Sonny's Blues. As I was going through and taking notes on the material, getting ready to kind of discuss it, I realized how long of a short story it is. And I tend to do this text with all of the classes that I teach. So I give it to the AP students just on their own. This is something that then they'll come in and discuss with each other in groups. I even read it with my 9th graders. I actually read it with my 9th grade, and it's now a text that I'm going to be using in the college class as well, alongside Going to Meet the Man, kind of an alternative text to that. But really, Sonny's Blues is probably the most popular story I think we see from Baldwin. It's highly anthologized, and I was introduced to it very early in my life, and I find when I cover it with students, they always really enjoy it. It's a heartfelt story. It's serious, maybe compared to some other texts that they've read, and maybe it deals with relatable situations, relationships with siblings and things like that. So it's usually, I think, a text that students really do enjoy. I'll get right into it because there's so much to cover. So in general, a way to think about this story is we are getting this gradual reacquaintanceship with Sonny, right? We're becoming reacquainted with him. And it's happening in various ways. And it starts early on here. But before we get to hearing about Sonny in the newspaper and the criminal drug activity, right, that he's caught up in, what we do is we get these kind of subtle lead-ins to the whole idea of a young man. And it starts when we have our narrator here, and we're given a brief kind of insight into what his life is like as a high school math teacher. It says he teaches algebra here as an English person. Somebody who teaches English, this is like the whole other domain, right, is the math stuff. Not that that's too important. What is important is this role as a teacher. A lot is to be said about the job of a teacher. And some of this could be positive, some of this could be negative. But we do get an early impression here on how he feels about the students that he teaches. Now, what's important here is, and we get it by the 4th paragraph, we are in Harlem, which brings a major social context to light here that we have to be aware of, such as the levels of poverty, the lack of opportunity, and definitely in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, we're also talking about the introduction of heroin, right, into various neighborhoods, Harlem being one that was obviously hit very hard by this, and the inner city populations here becoming heavily dependent on the substance, right, and basically the fact that it ruins lives, right? Heroin is a very powerful substance that's hard for people to stay off of, and that's largely what Sonny's life is all about. It's a big part of his life. Early, with these very young students, one of the big themes in the story is old versus young, and maybe even the transition into these later stages in life. And we always see this kind of brightness and this coppery kind of skin tone, right? We'll see this with Sonny. We see this with some of the young kids in his classes. And I think this is more or less a positive thing, because the opposite of this is going to be this kind of darkness that kind of sags, right? This weight. But here we see this kind of brightness and this openness in the 3rd paragraph here early in the story. He makes a pretty critical statement by the end of the 4th paragraph. He acknowledges that there's a lot of people using horse, another word for heroin, in this time period in the bathroom, right? They could be going and popping off needles and doing what they need to do. And he says maybe it did more for them than algebra could. And this is a bit counterintuitive. We would expect a teacher to have a optimistic perspective on students staying off of drugs, staying on the straight and narrow, doing well in their classes. But it's almost like he has given up on the whole idea of success for these students, right? And maybe, but we also can look at this another way as well, which is maybe the idea of doing drugs peddling drugs. We see a lot of people, such as Sonny, are in a way involved in selling it, the criminal activity of selling it, mainly only because they're trying to use it, right? They're trying to get the substance because they need it, right? They rely on it. So there could be other ways of understanding what their needs are. It's not going to be doing well in a math class and then graduating with those grades. It's going to be trying to cope with these really ill-fated environments, right, where things are really pitted against you. Harlem is, I think by the end of the story, we're supposed to really reflect on the beauty of Harlem, especially in terms of families and traditions and communication and things of that nature. But we also cannot deny the fact that Harlem is where the drug activity springs from, right? It's where some of the most base, kind of vile behaviors and characteristics that we get caught up in our younger lives and in our adult lives occur, right? So there's a lot that goes into a statement like this. But you see his attitude. He is not wearing the cape, ready to solve all of the ails that surround him, including drug abuse amongst students here. And this was an epidemic in these neighborhoods at this time. I'll give a little bit more context on that later on. The laughter, the last thing I'll comment here on the first kind of major, first page here, the laughter of the young people is denigrating. It's not a joyous laughter. It's already transitioning into, or has transitioned into, that adulterated kind of laughter, right? Where it's more cynical and designed, knowing that life is just kind of, nonsense in the first place, right? Or just kind of filled with insurmountable obstacles. So they carry that cynicism with them, even in these early stages of life. And they can't even be children, right? I guess that's part of the idea, is that the children can't be children any longer because of the environments that they are growing up in. And anytime in this story, we'll learn more about some of the background, but when we get this reference to children, one child we should always keep in mind is the child that the narrator loses, right? That he's lost, Grace. Always keeping that one in mind, because after the loss of Grace, and that works on a religious level as well, right? Grace, salvation, after graciousness, after that loss, what do we live on, right? After the loss of Grace, literally, how does he live? The loss of his daughter. But after the loss of Grace, in terms of this kind of religious substance, how do you live after the loss of that as well? How do you carry on? He even says the authority of their curses, the young people. It kind of reminds me of the beginning of an Eric Sermon and Keith Murray song, Hostile. And the first, they dubbed it from something else, but it goes, I got a right to be hostile. And the reason whoever says this is, I live in a horrible world, and I live with so much against me and oppression and just, bad things occurring. You can call it bad luck. And so my response is, I got a right to be hostile. And that could be the case of these children. They know the world they're growing up in. And so they have this authority in the way they curse and this insular kind of mocking that goes on here, right? It's all just a reaction to their surroundings, I think, in the end. One boy, thank goodness we get the small paragraph, but one boy is, like whatever, whistling a tune. And it comes out of him like a bird. And that's a beautiful way to put it. In fact, my mom, right, her maiden name is Bird, and it's an English name, so it either means you were involved with birds, like maybe you kept birds, cared for birds, who knows, or lived near birds, maybe that's what it is. But it also could be, singing voices, right? You were known for good singing voices. And that's the way it's being used here, right? It's the beautiful voice, just like the singing of the whistling of a bird. This is very kind of on the nose, because one of the allusions that we get much later on, as Sonny opens up about the kind of music he likes and the up-and-coming jazz artists that he's into, it's going to be Charlie Bird Parker. I think he was known as Bird, right, because of the way he could play his instrument. And so that could be an early, I guess you could just say kind of a foreshadowing, but there is suffering and there is this kind of, denigration everywhere we look, right? And we fall victim to it. But some of us have this kind of beautiful voice or this beautiful music that can, and this is important, carry us through all of that. And we get that, right? The beginning of the story is very unfortunate, right? We have a teacher who seems to have lost all hope for his students. Drugs are winning out. This kind of prevailing negativity is winning out. So not a great kind of beginning here. But it's nice to see this one boy who can hold it all together with song, right, and push through. We then we get a quick reference, the narrator, and notice for this whole story, this long story, we get no name for our older brother here, the narrator. He is just older brother, right? That's all he is. We do get a name for his wife. His wife is Isabel. Translates to, a lot of religious kind of motifs here, I think. Pledge to God. God is perfection and beautiful. Same as like Elizabeth, right? Isabel, Elizabeth, pledge to God. And maybe that is something that Sonny has in mind here. Not that it ever gets explicitly stated, but perhaps implicitly. We are really talking about a commitment to God, perhaps, or at least ideas of renewal and faith and pushing through challenges. Next up, so we shift then as he leaves the school behind, happy to get out of that environment, right? He's kind of wants to get out of there. Then we get this more, and it runs on for a few pages here, this intimate encounter with an old buddy of Sonny. And it's not just any old buddy. It's a buddy who also went down the same path of drugs, in fact, was instrumental, no pun intended, with the, Sonny's Blues here in music, but was instrumental in getting Sonny on drugs in the first place. And I'll talk about that in just a second. But it is something that strikes me for this scene is the young man's, at least at first, uncanny resemblance to Sonny. Almost like we're talking about the same person. It's a way of us starting to think about Sonny after years, it seems, right, for the narrator, of not thinking about Sonny. It's a fitting lead-in, right, to Sonny and his own particular story. And it's very similar because we are talking about drug abuse here, right? He hates this guy, he says it, but now abruptly, I hated him. And we have to ask ourselves why. Why does he hate this man? And it could be because he associates him with the downfall of his brother, or just represents some vague understanding of the problems that his brother has as well. But he hates the guy, right? He wants to get rid of him. He looks, the young man is, disheveled, raggy, smells, he says. He's out on the streets. This is a life, unfortunately, devoted to drugs, right? And you can't get off the substance, and it's tragic. Some of us, as I put this together, I'm very mindful, we might know people who can't get off drugs, right? Really powerful substances, and it tears them away from families and obligations or whatever it is, right? Or just the beauty of their own lives, and it's really hard. And I know for some of us, we deal with these things, myself included, definitely. This one hits home a little bit. But he has he despises this person at first. This will change by the end of this scene. The older brother says, I wasn't there, I stay away from them people. He does seem to really, almost in a kind of nonchalant but harsh way, categorize himself from anyone who does drugs or falls victim to these circumstances. And I don't know, maybe the way we should be thinking in society is we all have something in common here. Even the people out on the streets who can't get their lives together based on drug abuse, mental illness, whatever it may be, to remember our commonality. That could be me or some other way of understanding that. He doesn't seem to do that, right? I stay away from those people. Notice his attitude. Again, will this change? He is the dynamic character of the story. The brother, though it's so much about Sonny, the brother is the main character. He's the protagonist of this piece. And he always has the passing of grace on his conscience, right? To cope with the loss of his daughter. That's always there for our narrator. Moving on, like I said, the dude's in really rough shape. When you see people in shape like this, I don't know, it is, you need to get help. You need to get treatment. And unless people are ready to quit, those steps are never going to be taken, right? In many ways, the people who are on drugs, they have to do it for themselves, right? They have to be ready. They have to be ready to commit. If they can't, it's just not going to work. So this guy doesn't look like he's really committing to the process, at least not currently, right? Also, what's interesting about the scene is this young man, almost like a reporter, seems to know more about Sonny than the older brother here, right? Which, again, is very ironic. In life, we expect family members to know quite a bit about each other. Right? They communicate, they stay in touch. Not the case here. And so, therefore, this is a learning process for the brother. Right? He's learning about his younger brother, Sonny. So important to do early on. Very pessimistic attitudes here. And when we talk about blues as a form of music, thematically, it's about, at the end of all the suffering in really tragic circumstances, hope. It's about hope. No hope here, he says, this man on the street. Can't much help old Sonny no more, I guess. And it does seem like this hopelessness that we have here. And maybe that's the challenge that we're up against. The brother thinks to himself, it was what I was thinking, and so it seemed to me he had no right to say it. He seems to have this kind of grief. His grief for Sonny is a private affair, right? Only he can really think these thoughts here. The guy may be giving us a very clear indication of his own tragic life. His circumstances says, if I was smart, I would have reached for a pistol a long time ago. He would have killed himself. It's funny. Suicide pops up a few times, almost to the point where we got to put out those disclaimers, right? If you or anybody you know is having some feelings, right? There's so much help out there, right? And it's so important that we get that help when we need it, right? Life is beautiful in the end. And sometimes we just need help, right, to get through things. So I just want to mention that because it is mentioned here at least a couple times. Once here, Sonny will mention this later on. Sometimes the thought passes your mind when you're deep into this drug stuff. I'm better off dead. And so the thought of the contemplation of suicide is there. It's almost like a Hamlet moment, which I never really thought about until I looked at this text, preparing for this lecture. It's a big topic, right? When things get that bad that you just want to off yourself, right? And what does the narrator say to this? Again, he's a teacher. We are almost bred in this day and age to be like, well, let me get you the resources that you need and let me talk to you, right? And we can discuss, and I'm here to help you out. Doesn't really say that. Instead he says, if it was up to me, I'd give you one. Ouch. He really seems to cross a line there, so much that he feels immediately guilty for what he says, right? And then he immediately says, what dawned on him in that moment for the older brother here is, this guy has a story. Just like my brother has a story. Just like I have a story, right? Really, we all have stories of pain and suffering and what we've been through and what we go through. That's one of the biggest themes of this story, right? Of this story, is that we all have stories, right? We all have these experiences, and we really should be encouraged to share them because there's so much to learn about ourselves and our lives through this. Then we get into a very quick, I guess you would say, description of a barmaid. Interesting term. I don't know if we really use that term anymore, but like a bartender, somebody cleaning up, doing what they got to do around the bar there. And she's dancing around to music as she's cleaning up and kind of doing her work. And then we get this other description of her face. When she smiled, one saw the little girl. One sensed the doom. When she smiled, one saw the little girl. One sensed the doomed, still struggling woman beneath the battered face of the semi-whore. It's almost like we're seeing her in two different versions of her life. One is a young girl, but the only thing that's making that possible, the smile that reminds us of youth and innocence, the only thing that's making that possible is the music coming out of that jukebox, right? Otherwise, in a sense, what it's covering up, or the other side, the big reality is, and I'll just repeat, the still struggling woman beneath the battered face of the semi-whore. A woman who prostitutes herself part-time, also works this job, and has to face probably male abuse, right? Physical violence on behalf of this job, or it could come from some other source. Who knows? That's a crappy life. That is a very crappy life. And yet the music gives some kind of way to push through, right? As she goes about her work in this bar. It's so important to read in, I think, with great to read into this detail with great concern, because it really speaks to major themes, the power of music, right? Notably the blues, which of course originates out of Harlem, right? This new perspective on music and sound and the urban black experiences in that time period that it represents. It obviously is a voice, right? A major voice that builds during that time period and carries on to this day and age, of course. Beyond that, though, I don't want to skip this. This is such great detail, too. When this young man on drugs on the street says, right here, I'll just read it, "I never give Sonny nothing," the boy said finally, "but a long time ago I come to school high and Sonny asked me how it felt." And then what does he say? "I told him it felt great." So, ouch. I mean, if I heard my younger brother, right, concerning my younger brother, and you're the one who got him hooked on drugs, I don't know how I'd react, right? But he shares that information, probably out of guilt, right? That's one. It's almost like a confession. I might as well say this to you. And then right after that, the narration reminds us that we're surrounded by this kind of menace. I think the menace, most notably, it could be other things, because we're going to get some other forms of, insurmountable, it seems, kind of obstacles in this story. But drug addiction, right, is the big menace when we talk about Harlem and this period. There's no hope, there's no escape. That seems to be the theme that's presented early on. And all of this gets us ready just to be reacquainted with Sonny, who's facing all of this, right? Living this day to day. And there's this dread. You don't get it too often in this story, but an iciness starts to build in the older brother's guts. And I think it's just a dread of Sonny's impending doom, right? If things don't change, right? Just always having to worry about this day in, day out. It's not just hard for the people on drugs, as we all know. It's hard for the families who are losing their family members to drugs. It's tragic for them too. Moving on here. The young man points out this irony. The brother asks, why does he want to die? Doing drugs like this, why does he want to die? He don't want to die, he wants to live. And it's a tough paradox to have to describe. There could be various ways of understanding that, but it does speak to a paradox, right? He's really not trying to die. There's a life trying to take place here. It's just happening alongside this drug addiction, right? We got to figure this out. Lastly, the scene ends perfectly with this young man asking for, hey, you got $1? Can I borrow $1? Remember inflation, this story's being written, I think, in like probably the 1940s, I think is a safe bet. 1940s, 1950s, maybe 1930s. Hipsters, which leads into like the beatnik generation, which was highly advocating of drug use, right? Especially like hallucinogenics and things that really altered reality in order to produce art and such, right? And expression. So it's all kind of in that time period, right? He's kind of part of that category, if you will. Definitely a hipster. We even get the word used for Sonny later on. And hipsters are known, maybe not currently, but in the past, to experiment with drugs, right? Or definitely use drugs, hardcore substances. All right, moving on. He asks for $1, and then all of a sudden it hits the narrator. He doesn't hate this man anymore, and he even gives him a $5 bill, which is a lot, right? I won't just give you $1 here, take a 5. What causes this change in feeling is a question I love to ask students when we get to this point. We get a lot of good answers, some being he realizes that he reflects on Sonny. Maybe he's sad that this guy seems to know Sonny better than he does, right? So it's like, yeah, the least I can do after giving me some information is, this $5 bill. Or it also could just be sympathy for the man's circumstances as well, right? Just trying to help him out after learning how he feels about his situation, what he's going through. The guy doesn't even want to look at the $5 bill, almost like he's afraid, embarrassed. This is interesting, and not that it really factors into perception or ideas about people on drugs, but definitely like poor people, people in need, people panhandling on the streets, they grow accustomed to this lack of dignity. Like it's a whole life based on handouts and taking things and saying thank you and all this, that maybe it's just, it's hard for him and he feels a little guilty to accept such large a bill, right? Knowing what he's probably going to do with it. Spend it on drugs, spend it on heroin, unfortunately. Moving through this next page, which I can do so rather quickly here, we get a letter. We get a little letter that Sonny writes about his life after he goes away for a spell, right? There's a lot of like distance and time apart in this story between these two brothers, but it's obviously a story about two brothers reconnecting all the same. In that letter that Sonny writes, I just like to point out this one thing because it feels quite tragic, his state of regret and depression. He says, "I'm glad Mama and Daddy are dead and can't see what's happened to their son. And I swear if I'd known what I was doing, I would have never have hurt you so. You and a lot of other fine people who were nice to me and who believed in me." To say I'm glad they're dead so they don't have to see me, that's harsh. That means you really can't stand your current condition, right? And that's how he feels about himself. There's a lot of remorse here with Sonny from the beginning of this piece. And it could be Sonny, son, new day, right? New generation, a new dawn at hand, a new sun, right? Is really what we're dealing with here. And he's showing promise of that early on, at least in terms of regrets, how he's treated other people. Trouble does not stop, he says. And this reminds us of an important theme. Quite notably, trouble never stops. We will always have trouble in our lives one way or the other. And so it reminds us, I hate to allude to some elements of the story later on, but the very end, the very cup of trembling that we get, the trembling's never going to end, almost like it's going to be the shaking our whole lives. And so we have to find a way to maintain, right? We have to find a way to maintain and push through all of this. Very good. And also what that speaks to also for Sonny with drugs is the steady threat of relapse that he can fall victim to. And he even says it later on. It can happen any time, right? The relapse. All right, very good. We are starting. What's so important about this beginning with the students shifting to this individual man on the streets who knows about Sonny and his plight is we're learning more about Sonny. We're considering Sonny's story. And when he sees Sonny, the very first description and simile that we get is like an animal waiting to be coaxed into the light. And the light is a very positive motif throughout the story. Darkness, light, very strong contrast throughout the text. And he wants to be lured into the light. And I think what that means is he wants to change his life. He wants to get off the drugs, the darkness that comes with that. I know that's vague for me to put it that way, but I think you all know what I mean. And he's seeking an ear, his brother, to listen unconditionally, right? It's hard for some people to talk about drug addiction because they have their own views on things. Well, you just don't do them, right? Or you go to this treatment center and you just get it done, right? And you get off the drugs. Maybe it's not as easy as that, and we got to hear those stories. And so maybe that's what he needs, right? Being coaxed into the light. He wants to come into that light. And the light is beautiful because it's the bandstand light at the end. It's the spotlight in the middle of the stage. All the men are scared of it, which could be a new life. But it's there. And at some point they get into it, right? Just like this, coming into this relationship with his brother. He's seeking an ear so he can play his music, so he can express his story, right? And his perspective. It's so beautiful, really, the way Baldwin puts this story together. It's really a masterpiece and timeless, I think, altogether. All right, we also get some recollections of Sonny as a baby. When he started to walk, he walked right to me and I held him up. That's that's almost like the micro macro. Micro is just this small moment in time I helped him walk. macro is I helped him live. He's always depended on me. He's the one who, whenever he feels like stumbling and needs to stumble into somebody's arms, I'm the one who's there. So this speaks volumes about their entire, young lives, I guess you could say. And it even says, I'm the first one, who caught him when he took his steps in this world. He broadens it to the entire world, which is to say the world itself is filled with challenges, right? And the need for protection and guidance, the kind of protection we provide our young, right? Very good. Always interesting that they conflate Indian as in Indian and like Southeast Asia, and then then of course they talk about Indian as in Native American. They conflate the definitions here, which that's all I'll point out. I don't really have too much to say about that. As they are driving through Harlem, right, and the narrator, as we get into this scene, he has very judgmental attitudes about Sonny, his ideas about his life. He kind of trivializes this idea of almost like Zen Buddhism, trying to filter out the meaningless yet pervasive elements of our life to focus on the pure absolute ones, which easier said than done. But he really trivializes this. He has a kind of condescending attitude on this. And that's where we begin. We have to remember this is early in the story, right? And maybe the older brother, our protagonist, is stuck in these attitudes. Now, as we go through Harlem, we're talking about Lenox Avenue. I listen to a lot of Cameron and some artists based out of Harlem. You got Big L, you got some other artists, Mace, right? Some of these big artists back in the day. That's where we are, right? We're right in Harlem, but we're also, and I'll just pull out some language from this very descriptive big paragraph, the killing streets of our childhood. And these, he says, were the environments in which, I guess you could say, boys became men, girls became women. Engaged in older, more questionable, more risky, more destructive behaviors in our lives. As it says here, we stole the basements that we had sex in for the very first time, and we started to indulge in some of these things. The rooftops from which we hurled tin cans and bricks, which anyone will tell you, you don't do that, right? You're going to hurt someone. It's a horrible thing to do. Why are you? It sounds very malicious. So this is all sin. Harlem and the world in general is the playground of our sins, right? It can all happen right here. And they aren't holding back in these younger ages, this adolescence. And we also get some language here. It's all happening on the streets, but okay, go into your homes. You're smothered in the houses. And so you go back outside and you're encircled by disaster. There's a very sinister, insidious nature to Harlem here. And I don't want to overstate that, because I think there's also very touching sentiments to Harlem as well here, especially when we think about the music and the tradition and what we see at the end. But we can't avoid these details as well, right? And so they're just traveling through in a cab, right? Looking out the windows, and the narrator is remembering all this in his mind, and he's thinking, holy crap, I'm bringing Sonny back into this environment, right? We get some more description as they continue to travel along of the projects being these huge kind of urban developments, big apartment buildings, which always started with this kind of idyllic sentiment, which was, we're going to have these really nice apartments for people in need, right? And they're going to be modern and get, with all the features needed for hospitable living. And that doesn't end up being the case, because it's overridden by human sin, right? And our kind of ability to destroy each other, destroy ourselves. Again, I'll just pick out a couple of details here, the biggest being this one. The playground is most popular with the children who don't play at jacks, or skip rope, or roller skate, or swing, and they can be found in it after dark. A place like a playground with all these wonderful equipment and swings, that's supposed to be the the realm of children and innocence and purity and letting them play. And we always have that in mind as adults. We want these places to be pristine in that sense, safe. Guess what? It can't happen in these neighborhoods. It's been invaded. It's been overrun. So it creates this sense of suffocation. Where do we go? Where do we grow up? Where do we have these safe childhoods, right? It's not happening here. These projects are to be, in my opinion, futile attempts at humanizing our inadequate housing accommodations, including the safety of our young from reality's harshness, right? The evil that pervades in the streets. And the desperation. You know, I think drugs commonly comes from a lack of opportunity, a way to cope with challenges in our lives. So we keep that in mind, right? It builds a sympathy for Sonny and for all people out there who are engaged in such activities. Next up. Thank goodness for Isabel. She really seems to have her arms open for Sonny because he's going to live with them. He's got really nowhere else to go. They're going to try to keep him clean. They're going to try to keep him happy, accommodated. And guess what? They even have a piano, which is wonderful for Sonny because it's going to give him something to occupy himself with. And it's going to, you know, really provide that crutch that he needs here as he tries to stay clean in their home. So it's nice to see Isabel. She really is her name. This is the grace of God, right? The grace of God, arms open, and hers are all the same. And they have a special connection. I always like to read about this, read this. It was nice to see her face so vivid again and to hear her laugh and watch her make Sonny laugh. She seems to be one of the only minor characters in the story that has this ability to make Sonny feel comfortable, right? She even gets him past his first faint stiffness. That could be drug related, like a withdrawal of some kind. It also just could be extreme shyness. I'll leave that up to you. And it says, thank God she was there. Well, yeah, because she represents grace, right? Yeah, that's exactly. It's almost like God being there, right, for Sonny. And I think a lot of the religious motifs, allusions are understated in this text. But here I think you have an obvious one, all right? Narrator gets that icy dread again. It's just the worry. I think it's the constant worry for Sonny. Is he going to be able to hold this all together? It says in the end of this paragraph, I was trying to find out something about my brother, and that's a good thing. Right? I think that spells out progress for our narrator here. All right. From there, it's worth mentioning there's kind of a flashback that occurs. Well, now we're going to go back to having a conversation with the mother, Sonny's mother, the narrator's mother, right? And she's going to share some stories. And there's the key word, stories. We all have stories. And these stories allow people to understand our lives, our feelings. So we have to share these stories. And she's going to do the same here. Before that, we just find out a little bit about their father. And their father was part of a generation. If this story is being written, the time period is 1930s, 1940s at the latest, then the father was living in like the early 1900s, maybe even the 1890s. And one thing we have to do, because I didn't even realize till going through this story, getting it ready, this other major theme that's being dealt with, especially by the end of the story, is racial relations. Especially in that time period where they were probably more pronounced, they were more defined. There was no encouragement or, fading out the lines between this is white and this is black. There was no intermingling all too much, right? And you had these strong antagonistic feelings on both sides of the aisle. And why wouldn't you? Because look at the treatment, right, coming from white people and the level of resentment and opposition that fervors on the black side of things, right? So of course it's going to make for a pretty awful situation. That's the generation the father comes from. And when he says, right in the beginning of this kind of flashback, safe hell ain't no place safe for kids nor nobody, I think part of what he's saying is because of this white oppressive society that we live in, right? There's a danger, a real present danger, ever-present danger to Black lives. And we can talk about this in today's context with police brutality, more of it directed against, arguably, I guess you got to look into the stats of this, of course, Black populations. So there's a real history of this, right? Violence used against Black populations. Not to mention slavery, right, in its most abject form, right? It's all based on violence, right? And using that as a way to subdue and control. So I think we have to remember that. It's not just safe like drug activity and what's on the streets, especially when we talk about the father's time period. They didn't have heroin, right? That wasn't the epidemic of the time. I don't think there really were any major drug epidemics outside of maybe alcohol and some things like that, but I could be wrong. Different generations. Just want to keep that in mind. And with different generations comes different perspectives on race and racial intermixing, right? Different impressions on this. All right. We find out there's some similarities between Sonny and the dad. The main one being they're both kind of passive aggressive. They keep to themselves, especially when they're upset, right? Or they are angry. They keep to themselves. They basically just create distance between them and everybody else. There's the one thing they have in common. I would argue, as we read more and more of this story, that it could be the narrator, the older brother, who's just as culpable when it comes to creating distance, right, between him and other people, because it seems like he's done that quite a bit as well, and not really opened up to the major issues that he's been carrying with him, notably Grace, right, getting over his daughter. All right, so when she starts to tell stories, he remembers her wearing, and I always see her wearing pale blue. She's always wearing the color pale blue. Pale blue reminds us of childhood, but it also reminds us of the blues because it's expression, right? This will be expression through dialogue, storytelling, sharing anecdotes, things about our families. The other side of that is music, right? And we do that in music as well. In this wonderfully, I won't get into too much detail here, right, just to save time, but this is where we get in this paragraph that's about sitting in the living room from a child's perspective, surrounded by adults. It's getting dark outside. The lights remain on in the living room. And as children, we feel protected, especially because the adults know what's out there. And that's what we get here. Everyone is looking at something a child can't see: the drug addiction, the lack of opportunity, the need to join up with gangs, right? If you think about the inner city environments, everybody is looking at something a child can't see because the child's not acquainted with that destructive world yet. Racism, right? That's out there. These children don't know it yet, but it's out there. And I feel, if I'm a child, I would much rather, one thing he loves to feel here is the hand rubbing along his head here, right? While the light in the living room with the darkness or reality coming on outside, the grim reality, right? All of that, of what that contains. I would rather have my head stroked by adults who know the destructive reality, who know about it, who know how to live with it and cope with it, than an adult who never has done that. And that's what adults represent in the story. We are those who have lived through it, right? At least those in these communities. And so there is a form of protection here. And to say we never want that hand to stop stroking our head is to say we never want to stop being protected. And maybe there's a lot of truth to that, right? That goes away as adults. We are the protectors. We no longer just get to be protected. And isn't that a beautiful thing about childhood, is that feeling of that kind of eternal protection, right? It's always there for us, right? So what do those adults see outside that the children are not aware of? It's reality. It's the hard blows of life. It's poverty, it's abuse, it's racism, right? Anything really that's out there. Very good. Very good. We just want to be protected by those who can contemplate the dangers of our world that are pitted against us, right? We need that protection. And when the light fills the room, the child is left with a certain darkness, right? Kind of a paradox here in the way we describe this motif of light and dark. Because the idea is you're getting closer to the darkness outside. You will transition into adulthood. You will know that darkness intimately. It will be a part of your life. It's what all the old people have been talking about, and you've just been eavesdropping. But one day you will be in it, right? You will be in it. Moving on. Sonny was out somewhere. She's telling this story, and in that moment, Sonny's out on the streets, probably doing drugs, engaged, right, in that activity. So you can see the worry, in a sense, on the mom, that's on the mom's mind here. And then she basically presents the task. You need to be there for your brother. But she adds a little caveat. Not like stop him from doing everything bad. That'd be wonderful if we could do that, right? If we have that level of control and influence. It doesn't always happen that way. Ask anybody who knows a drug addict. We've all tried. Everybody's tried to say something. Everybody's tried to do something. That's why these shows like Intervention are fairly appealing, because it shows the level of intervention that is needed in some people's lives, right? But she says, you're not going to stop the bad stuff. It's going to happen. But be there for him when it does. And that's the task. And I think what I love about this is it really gives us this kind of promise, this commitment that we can see, I don't know, maybe not even halfway through the story, getting there, that the narrator will have for his brother. Let's see if he can live up to this, right? All right. She shares a story. This story is all about a hate crime. Lo and behold, their father, who grew up in this time period of very clear racial kind of division, right, and treatment, where I think black people obviously didn't have the rights and the recourse to address certain abuses against them. It was just kind of commonplace, and they had to deal with it, which is just godright awful, right, when you think about it. She shares a story of the dad and his brother. She says, guess what? Your dad had a brother, and guess what? He loved music. And if you're reading the story, you immediately make the connection, the similarity to Sonny. Sonny loves music. Well, here's an uncle that loved music. And they were coming back from a show, singing, right, playing the guitar one night. And they're going down the street, and all of a sudden down the road, he went to go pee. Then he comes into the moonlight, and very purposeful. Baldwin brings him into this center stage, right? Almost like a spotlight, the moonlight. Brings him right into center stage. And what happens? A group of white people basically run him over. It's a hit and run. They kill him, right? And they go off riding into the darkness, and that's it. It's just a dead black person now on the street and no accountability. I'll read the very end of this. These are white guys terrorizing in order to find entertainment. Now, we don't know what their reactions to this are after. The only thing we hear is after they hit him, they're hooting and they're hollering, right? Which means they got some pleasure out of this, some excitement. Probably drunk, who knows, right? Who knows? But I'll just read the end. Your father says he heard his brother scream when the car rolled over him, and he heard the wood of that guitar when it gave. He links the body to the guitar, right? Almost the same thing. And he heard them strings go flying, and he heard them white men shouting, and the car kept on going, and it ain't stopped till this day. Now, notice the hyperbole. Obviously, that car stopped at some point. It ran out of gas, or those guys went somewhere and got out of the car, and that was that. However, this is hyperbole. It ain't stopped till this day. How do we interpret that, right? Well, it could be that the consequences, the pain and the suffering that this caused his father, their father, the whole family involved here, that's never stopped. This is going to embolden this black family to hate white people even more, to never trust white people ever, that every white person out there is the one that essentially killed his kid. That's the way it's described. The dad is going to look, this black father is going to look at this. And that's tragic too. But then again, doesn't he have a right to be hostile? Doesn't he have a right to have that feeling toward white people in general based on what happened to his brother, this senseless taking of his life, right? So, and the ending of the music, the ending of this idea of expression and our individual kind of voices here. It says right here, till that day he died, he weren't sure, but that every white man he saw was the man that killed his brother. So it created this ongoing resentment. But it's, I would say it's kind of hard to avoid that, right? Moving on. Now, before I do move on, this is important. This is where the theme really kind of presented itself to me a little bit more as I went through this. And it's this. That's an unfortunate outcome. He's going to hate white people for the rest of his life, and maybe arguably so. However, Sonny, a generation down the line here will not share in that same feeling toward white people. We get through very little detail, but it's there. He's in Greenwich Village. He's in these artist communities. He's got a white girlfriend. He doesn't share that same division, right, and that resentment. So it's generational. And then we get into the very end, and I'll talk about that here in just a little bit. She says she was happy. She was there for her father after he lost his brother. She said, I was there to see his tears, to show me he was vulnerable, how he was feeling. That's important. They say it's easy to cry about things, but it's harder to cry in front of people because of the vulnerability that we see here. And the dad was usually not one to show this. So we got to be there for someone who is crying so they can let it out. It makes us think of the narrator the most, however, with the loss of Grace. Notice he's lost a daughter here. He'll open up a little bit, that's part of it, gradually over the course of the story, but a lot of this he keeps to himself. And maybe he needs to let it all out, right? You're not going to be able to stop him from doing bad things, she says one more time, but you got to be there for him, right? Now, this will transition into another section here, another dialogue, another scene with dialogue between Sonny and his older brother, the narrator, and they're going to be talking about what Sonny wants to do with his life, right? After coming out of this tumultuous time period, being addicted to drugs, trying to find some kind of stability, he's going to open up about what he wants to do. And what does he have in mind? Well, you could say, in many ways, the older brother, especially because the mom and dad are no longer around, Sonny's still in this state where he needs help, right? He's trying to get his life back on track, not to be too cliched with that expression. But this could be hard for anyone who's in that kind of parental role to hear, which is, I want to make a career off of music because of what could be the impracticality. How are you going to turn that into a salary? How are you going to survive? How are you going to, provide for yourself and a family if that's something that you want as well? And so in a way, he brings up like the adult world concerns, right, for Sonny. And Sonny's response, and I think Baldwin does a great job of dialogue, this kind of natural dialogue between these two brothers, trying to get to kind of the core of the matter here. And you understand, right, why he would have some opposition to this idea. How are you going to survive? But Sonny seems to be very persistent, right? This is what he wants to do with his life. And the older brother has a hard time talking. The narrator has a hard time talking to him about these things because, remember, he's a teacher. He kind of took this direction, which did lead to, and there's good sides and bad sides to it, I would imagine, but a steady career as a teacher. Don't forget, when you talk to like loan officers, people who issue mortgage loans, they love teachers because teachers equal steady income, right? Compared to other professions that are out there that you don't know what the income might be coming in. Teachers, at least you know exactly what you're getting, right, for the year. So he's got that steady kind of existence here, and he doesn't feel like being a musician is going to lead to a steady life for Sonny. And then he assumes, and I think this expresses either a naivety on behalf of the older brother here or an arrogant sense of what music is suitable for his brother, but he assumes, oh, you want to do music, you must want to do some classical stuff. And that couldn't be further from what Sonny wants to do. Sonny is more in tune with the up and coming. For us, it's the past, but in the time period of this text, it's the up and coming jazz kind of movement. Now, jazz has been around for a while, but it's taking on, like a genre of music, it's taking on its own new interpretations and representations, and it must be a very exciting time. I think it's hard for us, unless we're really thinking about it, to feel the excitement of those new waves of jazz music that's coming out, most notably the allusion to Charlie Bird Parker, right, that we get here. And that'll be a contrast to Louis Armstrong, and the contrast to that would be Louis Armstrong, who represents an older, more traditional form of jazz. Still all very important, right, especially in terms of bringing that music to the forefront. But there are new interpretations of this based on perhaps new struggles. he wants to play with jazz musicians, right? And I think he does then say, I want to play jazz, but I think when he says, I want to play with jazz musicians, it does involve other musicians. It's like a sense of community, and that could be important for Sonny too. That seems to be reinforced by the end of the story when he's really seems to be a part of a group. Guys who know him on a familial level, more than, let's say, even the older brother does, right? Which is the ultimate kind of irony in the story here. And when he starts to think about the kind of music that Sonny wants to play, jazz, hanging out in these nightclubs, right, around what he considers a very different type of person or people from his own. When he thinks about the type of people that Sonny is, hanging out with when he's playing music, right, listening to music, performing, he seems to put these people in a class different than his own. He is the straight-laced teacher, right, going about his fatherly responsibilities, right, with his family. He's taking care of things. Whereas this is a different type of people who seem to not really prioritize those types of things in life, living more carefreely, but also at the risk of ruin, right, when you start to think about drug addiction. But another negative part of this, an unfortunate part is, and again, it goes both ways, but immediately classifying music with drug use. And obviously you can't do that. We have so many successful musicians throughout, generations that did it, clean, sober as can be. But we can also point to many, many, many notable examples of musicians, some making what we consider tremendous art, right? Necessary, right, art that they brought into the world, but they were doing it with the use of drugs, or always having drugs be a part of some kind of process, right, part of their lives in some way. So that's what we're kind of struck by here, is that some amazing music can come from individuals who are so riddled by drug use, right, and drug dependency. And that becomes perhaps the central primary struggle of their lives, right, is trying to do without the drugs or do things differently. Let's just put it that way. Moving on, he feels helpless. Not an easy place to be in, where your younger brother's explaining kind of the use of drugs, right, the people that he's hanging out with. The narrator here feels helpless because his sense of what Sonny should be doing with his life seems to be ignored, right? All that matters is Sonny's ideas, Sonny's voice. And that's new for the narrator. So there definitely is this kind of getting used to that, right? We see that throughout the text. This is where we get the illusion, and you got to look this up. I know I had to look this up a long time ago, but Bird Charlie Parker, right? Bird was kind of the nickname for this iconic jazz musician that was doing things a bit different, right? I wish I could speak more to the, detail, right, of in what ways he was providing new interpretations of traditional jazz, but he was one of those figures. Now, the other tragic feature here is that Charlie Parker was a heroin addict, right? So it really speaks to the hipster generation, the amazing music, right? The captivating music, the expressive music that's coming out of the generation, but at the same time, the unfortunate circumstances, right, of hardcore drugs, right, and finding dependency on these things. And for some people, you think of like Kurt Cobain, you think of countless other artists, Elvis, right? I mean, really the list goes on, people. I'm merely scratching the surface. Amazing artists, but really awful drug dependencies, which basically ruin their lives. It sometimes just goes hand in hand. I think that's one of the tragic realities that this story makes us think about, right? Explaining the relevance of jazz, even more just, this is my interest. This is what I want to do. And it seems to be a point of friction between the two brothers, right? Sonny even says, and I want to stress this with dignity, it don't make no difference, right? If you don't listen to this kind of music, I don't care. And it is a little bit of that passive aggressiveness, right? Let's not even talk about it then. Yeah, forget it, right? If you don't know who I'm talking about, right? the people that he finds to be great artists, right? Like Charlie Parker. And he says it with dignity. And this is very much a nice foreshadowing of the end of the text, when eventually we're with Sonny, we're in the nightclub, and it's nothing grandiose, right? It's just this kind of typical nightclub, right? We're just happy it's there. It's just kind of, you know, a lot of it's just kind of these dark shadows with just the light on stage. However, we'll be in Sonny's kingdom at that point. Quite literally, that's what's described. This is Sonny's kingdom. And so we see that level of respect and dignity start nice and early. I mean, I guess you would say a little after the halfway point of the story here, but we're getting that dignity out of Sonny. And that's important to take note of, right? We're going to see that dignity, I think, kind of take him to new heights in which we understand him perhaps better, his brother included here. This also kind of reminds us too, and I don't think this term was even alive in Baldwin's day and age. It was more like, well, maybe a little bit 1950s, but 1970s, 1980s, neoliberalism. And the idea of neoliberalism in education is the only thing you should really be doing with your time in high school and your time in college is basically getting ready for a career. That's it. You shouldn't be learning about yourself. You shouldn't be learning about the world, the beautiful things about it, the horrible things about it. You shouldn't be learning about any of this. You should just be getting the skills you need to get a job, right? And that seems to be the attitude of the older brother, right? Maybe it's something that he has to shake himself out of, that life can be different than just making a living, right? And kind of going through those check marks, right? Making sure all those check marks are checked off there. All right, very good. He even says it. You know, people can't always do exactly what they want to do. You could interpret that along the level of career. You can interpret it, you know, on broader terms, right? But you can't just do what you want to do, or else you're not going to make a living, and you're not going to be essentially kind of externally rewarded with what you need to do that thing that you want to do. You're going to be barely eking out, right, an existence. If that's what you want to do. He's trying to make Sonny think about these concerns. And then he says, the quick retort from Sonny is, I think people ought to do what they want to do. What else are they alive for? And so that's the great debate, really. Not just with this story, but in life in general. Should we just be worried about making a living and making money? Or should we be worried about being happy and doing the things that generally bring interest to our lives, right? And things that we want to pursue? Or do I gotta just get that job to make money, right? Just to keep everything afloat? That is one of the most crucial questions of our lives, right? And based on the paradigm that we live in, which is there's this idea of work, right? And it's out there, and for many of us, it's an inevitability, right? We are all going to be doing it. But are you happy? Are we happy? There's the big question. All right, very good. He talks about you're moving in with Isabel, right? So that's kind of the decision that everybody's made. It's going to keep you safe. It'll keep you protected. Still kind of that role of a younger person in need of that protection, right? They've made the decision. Now that runs counter to the idea that Sonny's made the decision for himself to live with Isabel, right? It's not really he doesn't have agency in that choice. So we keep that in the back of our minds. He even says, you decided it, he pointed out. The one thing he does make clear here is he wants to get out of Harlem. And that's tragic, because I think there is, and I'll keep stressing this, the wonderful aspects to Harlem that we see in this text, and that it builds almost thematically as well, right? Through this reflection on the past, right? And what his family has been through. The strong bonds there, definitely. But he needs to get out, because that's where the drugs are. That's the infestation that we're talking about, that this young man needs to get out of. So it sucks that you got to take yourself out of an environment that might have some of these positive, you know, rather joyous, harmonious qualities to them, but you got to get out because of the drugs. And that's the crappy part about addiction, apparently, right? Is that you really do have to remove yourself. And you see it. I know I keep talking about the cliched examples that we see, like cable TV and intervention, right? The A&E program. But literally, how does a successful intervention end? That person leaves their life for at least at least a few months, if not longer, right? It's probably like several months. They have to get away from it. And kudos to Sonny for knowing that. I need to get the hell out of here, right? Out of Harlem. So it's very much kind of this double-edged sword. Horrible that you got to get out of there because there's good things here, perhaps. But when you think about the forces at play and Sonny's vulnerability to all of this, it's his only choice. He slams the window so hard, it's almost like the glass is going to fly out. And I like that. Baldwin, these kind of, I guess you could say overstated moments, right? To remind us of the frustration that he is dealing with, right? That it's kind of peaking at this point, to the point where we almost break the glass here, right? And there's this kind of chaos. They got a piano at Isabel's. He has to remind him of that, right? And you can practice on it. And this is exactly what Sonny will do. And long story short, on this particular point, it's going to become the crutch, right? It's going to become the fill-in for the drug use, right? So it's essentially what's keeping him off the drugs. It's what's keeping him off the streets. He's just inside this house after school, right? And he's just playing on the piano. And it says he basically self-teaches himself, just listening to records, imitating that, and maybe learning how to break off and do his own thing from there. So it's a wonderful kind of story here, I think. Now, is he an amazing, #1 talent piano player by the end of the story? No, I don't think so. But that also makes it all the more endearing, is that it's not just being the best, it's just doing it because it's providing you with some benefits. And it's making you feel connected. So it's not even about just being, I'm going to be a major success with all this. The success is different, right? It's not monetary. It's going to be more communal, and also, what provides the opportunity to stay off of the substances here, right? And the people that he associates with as he plays all this music, they got their own issues too. And that's important to note because he's always talking about other people. Well, the way I see people do it, the way I see people handle their drug addictions, and some people got to play, and he's going to get into all of that, right, in these conversations. Now, the sound that Sonny produces within the home is very disconnected. He's basically practicing, and he's just trying to learn how to play the piano, but it comes across like all over the place, right? And it's very similar, in my opinion, to exactly how the conversation is going to play out in a few pages from now when he's trying to explain his drug addiction to his brother. Already an uncomfortable topic for the brother, and Sonny's going to try to explain it. And the way he explains it is almost like this, like practicing talking about it and just putting it into words, which must be incredibly important for a drug addict, right? To have to put into words the addiction and what they're dealing with and how they suffer. I'm sure that's a part of therapy and everything that they go through, I would imagine, right? I've never been down that road, thankfully. But you got to talk about it. So that's one way of understanding this too. It's just this kind of playing on the piano and learning how to play is eventually just going to be him learning how to talk about the things that he needs to talk about, right? So we're seeing a little bit of a kind of early form of that. It says here, almost feels cliche, but Sonny was at his piano playing for his life. And I like to stop there with students. It's a great question, because a great time to stop, because the question is, in what ways is that true? How is he playing for his life? One could be to stay off the drugs. One could be to give his life a sense of purpose, find enjoyment. You could come up with a lot of good ideas here, right? But one thing's for sure, he stopped going to school. And another thing we find out, and this is important, so important, because it's easy to gloss over in the story, this dense text. You forget about this, but we also find out that he's hanging out in Greenwich Village, and this is not Greenwich Village of 2025, where it's all gentrified, or regentrified, whatever it might be. This is back when it's a true to form artist community. And there does seem to be this dispelling of the importance of race. It doesn't matter anymore, right? That stuff, like we're kind of blurring the traditional lines on these things in order to find a higher realm, kind of transcend to a higher realm of importances within our world, race maybe not being one of them. Well, that's only going to exist in Greenwich Village, and that's why you see him having a white girlfriend. Sonny's got a white girlfriend. Now, why is that a big idea? Remember what we've learned about. The father, the racial turmoil, losing his brother in a white hate crime, right? An anti-black hate crime. We know the resentment that's lingered and been kind of passed on in some way, shape, or form to perhaps the narrator. Sonny's breaking away from that former way of thinking, right? The divisiveness between black and white. And maybe he's to be praised of that, right? I don't think when we read this, we stop too often to really consider this. But when you think about Isabella's family's past, in their attitudes, they seem to have this attitude: white people stick with white people, black people stick with black people. You think about the narrator and Sonny's father, what he experienced, his attitudes. This is the exact opposite. And does that lead to a kind of a conflict between these two different generations of black people, right? Something to think about. We keep on going here. We find out Sonny joins the Navy, kind of following in the same footsteps of the older brother. He was in the Army as well, and he ends up in Greece. Remember, he was even saying, like, I'll lie about my age, right? No problem. Just to get, it's a ticket out. It's a ticket out of Harlem. There does seem to be a lot of time that passes here, right? I think here he says he was a man by then, of course, making his own decisions, right? Kind of, existing within the world. But the narrator says, I wasn't willing to see it. And that's potentially, one of his biggest problems is he's so used to protecting him like a child. He's not ready to see him kind of struggle, falter, because it's going to happen, make decisions on his own and try to prevail, right, and sustain himself. It's never easy, right, for us to back off and be ready for someone to start to do that for themselves. Okay, very good. And that could be the icy dread. Remember, he's always worried about Sonny here. All right, very good. He goes almost like, I guess you could maybe even call this the climax. If the ultimate pursuit of this story of the narrator is to bond with his brother Sonny, because it seems to be the major issue, right? Getting back in touch with Sonny, learning about his life. This part of the story represents, and again, it kind of flash forwards, it goes back in time, right? Kind of catches up to itself. But this represents perhaps the climax in one way, because Sonny chooses a different family over the narrator, right? The actual flesh and blood brother. And he treated these people that were in his apartment in Greenwich Village, and he's living with these hipster types. And yes, I think the understanding is they're all doing heroin, right? They're just living a drug-driven lifestyle here, right? But there's a family of people in there, and the narrator feels like he doesn't belong. And I never noticed this till this time around, as he's walking down the stairs away from this apartment, feeling very neglected, very divorced in a sense from his brother. He's whistling to himself. And I think there's another thematic reminder, the power of music. This could be the climax of the text. Your brother has pushed you away so far as to now kind of take on this new family. That would be my worst fear for my brother, right? For him to, abandon me like that and take on a whole nother family, right? But he starts whistling, for the barking dog, to help him cope with this bad situation. And isn't that what music is? Definitely isn't that what the blues is, right? A way of coping, a steady beat that allows us to keep going, right? Right after that, that reference of the older brother actually whistling a tune, which is so rare in this story that he would do something like that, we then find out about little Grace. And I think it is symbolic. I think it's the grace of God, right? In addition, you know, obviously just his daughter as well. She has polio. I don't know too much about polio, but from the way it's described here, it really catches up with her quite quickly. And she has a fall. Not too worried about it at first, but then the aspect to this that makes us incredibly worried is the silence. That's when we start to worry. And that's true of like people in our lives. I talk to my mother every day. I talk to my brother every week. I talk to my dad every couple days, right? I keep up with my small family as it is. And there's no silence. So in a way, I'm not too worried about them. I might keep up. I know what they're doing. If there was silence, I would be worried, especially if it was abrupt. The way it happens here with Gracie, there's playing, we hear a loud noise, a fall, and then there's silence. And that's when we're worried the most, is when we have too much silence, right? I think that's thematic to the text here, for sure. That's why we were okay hearing Sonny bang away at the piano keys in the house, even though it was like, just, you know, didn't sound right. It was kind of all over the place. At least it was noise. Then he was gone, silence, and now we worry, right? So it's the silence is when we really, 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 really worry. It's commotion, then it's silence. That's when we worry the most. And we have two tragic deaths that are described in similar ways in this story. Again, something I didn't notice up until this time around. The death of Grace, which was just described. The screaming. The other screaming was the uncle on the road with the white men in the car. The screaming that we get there, right? So two enormous losses, right? Enormous losses here, which are spanning generations. It's bonding the suffering. It's kind of bringing that suffering together. We all experience it. It changes shape and form, but it's all there for the telling. And we owe it to ourselves to kind of do this. I think is another big theme for the story. Thinking about Grace, he says, my trouble made Sonny's real. So that should be a lesson to all of us. You got problems, well, just better believe it. The person next to you has problems, right? Absolutely. It should be a reminder. Seems to be a little bit of a lack of trust. He's just checking on Sonny when Sonny's back in the home, making sure he doesn't have any drug paraphernalia, things of that nature. Any I guess, good supporter would do this if you're really trying to keep somebody clean and off drugs. I think it's something you have to do, right? Here comes a very beautiful scene. The revival meeting that the narrator, I guess you could say, chances upon, and it has probably the most immense biblical overtones. They're singing songs about Zion, which for the most part seems to be about being saved, right? And finding a kind of release and freedom from undesirable circumstances, which could be downtrodden lives, living in poverty, drug dependencies, right? And living that life. The throes of racism, right, and living in a white-dominated society that treats you in a particular way that seems to go unchecked, right, and that leading to a further sense of dismay. I guess the list goes on and on here. So there's a lot of things that we're trying to find hope in dealing with. And this is all, I think, starts with a barbecue cook. Gotta love barbecue, unless you're a vegetarian or a vegan. But he's wearing, very symbolically, a dirty white apron. White apron is probably purity, innocence. That's childhood. We want to go back to the children having our hair stroked, protected by the adults that know the troubles of the world. We all want to go back to that. But we can't, because guess what? It's dirty. There's sin. There's all the abuses we go through, our own abuses of ourselves, etc. It's dirty, right? So it all starts with that. So we're looking for redemption. We're looking to be saved here. We're looking to get on that boat, right? That ship, which is reflected in the allusion to Zion here, right? And to be carried away to safety, to salvation. Grace. We got to get Grace back, right, in some kind of redeemable form, right? Obviously, she's not going to come back, but in terms of the narrator's mentality here. So there's a lot of really important religious, spiritual themes that connect to this scene. I think that's very obvious. They're talking about the old ship of Zion, and they're keeping a steady, jangling beat. And that's what it means to persevere, and perhaps what the blues offers up to us is that steadiness, that we can push through this through a kind of steadiness with our lives, right? And we're going to find that, whether it be drug dependency or pushing back against this kind of white supremacist society, right? We got to keep up this steady jangling beat here. Quick note on just the characters that are running all this impromptu revival meeting. It's a guy and two women, and they seem to be drug addicts themselves, perhaps, right? But at the same time, they're filled with a lot of gusto here. There's a nice line. It does say, like, nobody's being rescued. These are songs about being rescued, but the narrator says, but nobody's being rescued, right? So that's fine. So it's a song about hope, right? That's what's important to note. Here, yeah, if there's no hope, so be it. The reality kind of would suggest that, right? We see these neighborhoods. But guess what? That's the whole point of the song, is to provide that hope. There's a nice line here where the woman who's singing, who's, just probably on the younger side, she's got the tambourine. It says she's divided very little from another woman, heavy chapped lips, and face scarred and swollen from many beatings, and black eyes glittering like coal. Now, two different contexts. One is a young girl singing this revival stuff, right? Doing this performance. Another is a woman who seems to suffer from a lot of domestic abuse, and she's got a story, right? There's a whole bunch of stories right there just in this one woman's life. They're linked through perhaps hope, who knows, right? Or the music. Perhaps the music is the common bond between these two women who actually do have different lives, right? But it says here in the state, or in this moment, they are divided by very little, right? Almost kind of awkward phrasing there, but to get the point, they are the same here. The music soothes the poison out of them. That's incredibly poignant when you think about drug abuse, right? Drugs are absolute poison. Alcohol is a poison. Nicotine is a poison. Marijuana is not a poison. But people have problems with that too. But these are literal poisons that we are putting into our bodies, right? And we really should be aware of this. The music seems to bring it all out here. Barbecue cook half shook his head and smiled. I love that reaction because it seems to be a symbolic gesture. I'm going to shake my head at all this idea of hope, but I'm going to smile at it all the same because it's much needed, right? Maybe it's required for me, for all these people that are surrounding me, right? At this revivalist meeting on the corner here. In the midst of all of this, we see Sonny, and important description. He has the coppery sun brought out the copper in his skin. He has a certain lightness. Now, I don't think that means skin tone necessarily, but a brightness to his features and his character outside of being this kind of darkness to him, right? And that brightness in copper is what we associated earlier with youth. He feels younger here, not riddled by age and circumstance. Like his life can kind of go back in time, and he can be that young, impressionable, eager, we all want this, right? Person that we used to be before circumstances and bad decisions or our vulnerabilities got in the way, right, of all of that initial potential. He's likened to a hipster here. I looked it up. And I don't know if I shared it, but they call it the French Connection. It was like Corsican French gangsters working with the Sicilian mafia, and they worked to bring in a lot of heroin in the 1930s. So that's where we get these heroin epidemics starting to occur in the different boroughs throughout New York City, and Harlem is definitely one of those places that's hit hard by the heroin epidemic. So it's all part of the French Connection, which I think there's a movie about that as well. All right, 1930s is when this was taking place. And in that time, we start seeing hipsters, obviously probably correlating with music communities and artistic communities, but also, unfortunately, the use of hardcore substances, right? We see that as well. They were singing, "If I Could Only Hear My Mother Pray Again." The only thing to point out there is the importance of the mother figure in this text. really getting across the idea that you have to be there for your younger brother, right? Not going to change bad things, not going to change, stop all the bad things from happening, but you got to be there even when they are happening. And here we get toward the end of the story, last couple scenes. Sonny's like, you want to come and watch me play? You want to hear me play tonight at the nightclub, a small nightclub? And he's like, says right here, I couldn't possibly say no. Reasons to that could be the obligation to the mother, right? That's kind of subtly on his mind here. It also could be his own experience with losing Grace. That could be another reason, right? I need to have these connections. I need to try to do things differently here, right? I owe it to not only Sonny, but I owe it to myself as well. Now, this is when Sonny gets into perhaps the most uncomfortable conversation that he could have with his older brother, and that's going to be about the way heroin feels. I think a couple of the musical references that this connects to is going to be Sonny learning how to play the piano when in Isabel's home with her grandparents. And also at the very end of the text, which right around the corner here, when he's on stage playing with his fellow musicians, right, under the guidance of Creole. That's what this conversation largely feels like, right? Sonny trying to learn how to describe his addiction and perhaps alongside that cope with his addiction, right? Because that's largely what he's trying to do. And I think importantly trying to get the support of his brother here too. And again, I don't think, we all read this. To me, the way he describes drug addiction and heroin use, it's hard for me to even understand, right? Because I've never experienced that, and I don't hope to ever experience that. But I think it's supposed to be hard to understand, just like the music is at times throughout this text. And Sonny brings up another tough to consider point, which is to create such beautiful music, to create such beautiful art. You point to all kinds of artists that people have to go through a lot of suffering, whatever that suffering might be. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Like, we don't write short stories without a real sense of conflict, right? What are the conflicts at play here? Or why are we reading this story? And the same could be true of music, like really meaningful music and expression and poetry and literature, etc. It comes from real suffering, right? You think about the stuff that you're really turned on to, that you found interest in throughout your life of reading or watching things. Is it usually the sense of suffering that's taking place there that keeps you really interested in the first place? So there's a lot of that here. He brings up some of those really tough to consider ideas, I think, right? Maybe that's true. Maybe there does have to be suffering all the time in order for good things to come from that. So it's erratic, it's incoherent speech, right? This speech will mimic the discord of the musicians on the bandstand at the end of the text. They seem to find some trouble getting started as well. It seems similar to this conversation. In the midst of all of this description of his drug addiction mixed with the way that factors into his playing of music, his love of music, his appreciation of music and musicians, because it's all connected. That's part of the conflict he's dealing with, is how do I rip these two things apart, right? And keep them separate from one another. Sonny says, you've got to listen, you've got to find a way to listen. And I think that really encapsulates nice and clearly for us the central theme of this text, one of the central themes, which is we have to listen, right? Remember, that's what Sonny was looking for, really page 1 in this story, right? Is his brother to listen and understand his what ails him, right? And I think he's pretty successful in all of that too, in his own way of doing that, especially in the end here as he invites him into the nightclub to hear him play with his bandmates here. And that's what we get into here, right? We get a paradox here as Sonny's describing all of this. He's looking helplessly young, looking old. So he's kind of young and old. Maybe he's within the transition of these two important times in our life here. The young and impressionable and the potential that we associate with that, but then the old age is all of that potential running its course, right? And you're left with only regrets, perhaps. And he's not a very young person. He seems to be getting into his 20s, right? Probably going into his 30s. So, you know, these are important times of our life. We don't want to just be living a certain way only to regret it later on. He says, I did awful things to other people. He was regretful of this in that initial letter that he sent to his brother. I'm glad my mom and dad aren't here to see me and the way I've treated, you know, everybody. So we know he's been a very regretful person. And he is looking probably in some way for forgiveness for the way he's treated other people and himself. There's a nice kind of a motif within this big paragraph. He's got a aluminum can and he's kind of rolling it and bending it so much that it starts to give, and now we got these glittering edges. And there is this again, I think it's almost that overstatement, right? This glittering edge. It makes me feel like if I was a parent looking out for the safety of my child, and all of a sudden I noticed they had done this with the can, and there was this danger that was that was present there, I'd rip it away from them. I would just go after the immediate protection mode, and I would take that away from them. What the narrator's going to do, always in a way trying to, as he changes, resist that parental kind of feeling, is he's going to let him play with it. He's just going to let him keep it, which is to say, I'm letting you deal with the challenges and the dangers of this world on your own, right? Which I think is another big theme as we move into the final scenes of this story. You're going to have to face this stuff on your own. You're going to have to get into the deep water, and you're going to have to swim. You're going to have to kick those legs as hard as that can be, because that's what life is. It is always coming with trouble. It is always filled with challenges of various kinds. We all got a story to tell, right? That's the whole point. But the hits keep on coming. I guess that's the big point here, right? Moving on. He reminds us that he unfortunately associates Harlem only with drugs, which again is not an implausible thing to do in this time period, because it really is wrecking these neighborhoods, right, in people's lives. So I had to get out of Harlem. It was the drugs. And he ends this by saying, I just want you to know it can come again. And when he says it, yeah, he's being vague, but I think we all know what he means. It's probably relapse. It looks like at this point he's found sobriety. And that's keeping those, we talk about being in the deep end and treading that water. That's what it means. Every day, they say, like, I can give one example. I smoked cigarettes for like 10 years. And really, once a cigarette smoker, in a way, always a cigarette smoker. And that might be even more true of heroin. Especially in the immediate years that we give up some of these substances, it might be harder. It is an everyday commitment. And he's reminding his older brother, I can relapse. And that's not an easy thing to admit to, because we want to all be strong, impermeable. Nothing's going to stop this. I am strong. I can get this done. I'm not strong. And that's why this story can be a reminder of the defeats in life, right? The things that we don't have the strength to accomplish. I can relapse. There's always this steady chance, unfortunately. Right? It can happen. I love this part because I have a brother and I love him so much. But he says, you're my brother, he said, looking straight at me and not smiling at all. And the narrator says, yes, I repeated, yes, I understand that. You're my brother, which the way Sonny says it encapsulates or encompasses, I should say, so many things. You're my brother. You need to take care of me. You're the one I'm supposed to be able to talk to. You're the one who should support my dreams no matter what they are. You shouldn't discourage me, right? There's so much we can say that's caught up in you're my brother. I just think it's so beautiful and it's so powerful. And I feel like it almost feels like as we get into this final scene, which is just remarkable in its own way. It could be a short story. The final scene could just be like a short story, who knows, right? But this could be the resolution. the older brother and Sonny really coming to terms and understanding the commitment they have to each other, which I don't even want to talk about it too much because it's just such a beautiful theme, right? Brothers, sisters, those we see as brothers and sisters in our lives, which really should be everybody, but making sure we're there for them. You're not going to prevent the bad things from happening, but you got to be there when those things are occurring, right? Last beautiful scene. Now, preparing this, I didn't really catch on this as much as I did this time around. I think the final scene here, it's very religiously kind of oriented, but it's also very racially oriented, right? This final scene. And, you know, we do Going to Meet the Man. That's the other story I got a lecture on. And that is just, you read that, it's about racism 110%, right? This text, we do have the hate crime. We have the uncle getting struck by the vehicle, right? That horrible incident is described. Other than that, it's a story about a lot of other, it's about, let's just say, a few other things, right? The music, the addiction, things like that. The family dynamics. Here, I think it comes back to the idea of race. Now, it starts with the person who essentially guides and organizes and keeps, like the glue, all these bandmates together on stage. And his name is Creole. And what does Creole mean? You've heard this term in history classes, right? Who knows? Political science classes. Creole means American born but European descent. All right, so black and white. It can be black and white. That's another idea, right? Is that it's a black person mixed with, so African and European descent mixed. And I think this is like the terms they use, right, in South American colonialist societies, right? So you can see it used there. Now, why is this, what should this remind us of? The two very different generational perspectives on race that we are given in the story. You have black men and women of old who say no intermixing, look at the world we live in, no way in a million years. And society's helping them with those divisions, right? Separated neighborhoods, perhaps up until certain decades in the North and even later in the South. So it's kind of inoculating all this stuff in the first place, right? Then you got Sonny, white girlfriend, doesn't seem to really give as much of that kind of concern to this issue of race, right? And maybe it's about white and black people coming together on more agreeable terms. It could be, right? But we do got this guy Creole. Now, I think another way of understanding this too is, if we got this idea of American-born European descent, it could also be this idea of what comes from Europe. A lot of instruments, the piano, the saxophone, this thingamajig, it all is coming from Europe, right? But now it's being put in African-American hands in Harlem in the 1930s, 1940s, right? To reflect new sounds, do new things with old instruments, right? And express new experiences with voices, right? It's doing all of those things with stuff that we're just borrowing from from kind of previous era or kind of, you know, part of the globe here, right? So I think that could be the idea here as well. A lot of darkness within this bar. Narrator's all by himself. Maybe he needs to be all by himself because this is going to become a pretty reflective experience for him as he watches his brother up on stage. From the minute we meet Creole, he's slapping Sonny's shoulder. He's saying, here's the man of the hour. You got a great musician in your family. And this really should contrast with the narrator. What do you want to be, a musician? Why do you want to do that? That sounds like a horrible idea. What about this? What about this? And here we have nothing but unconditional support from Creole, right? Who seems to be almost like a Santa Claus type of figure in some respects. Just his jolliness, his humor, and his direct need to keep these dudes together. Because I think he understands the turmoil of their lives, right? And this is their time on stage. Beautiful line here. Here, I was in Sonny's world, or rather his kingdom. Here, it was not even a question that his veins bore royal blood. And the color of royalty is purple. Keep that in mind because we're going to be basking in an indigo light, which is a mix of purple, royalty, what Sonny is at this point, and blue, which the blues, right? The art form, which I think is tragedy and suffering and pain, but the hope that just always remains, right? Always remains. Why is it ironic to consider Sonny royal? Two things. He's a black kid, probably not a lot of money, from Harlem, nursing a really bad drug addiction, right? And trying to redeem himself off of, or, from that, right? Trying to get clean. So why call this kid royalty? Another is, he's never really had the authority over his brother. When we think kings, we think of this kind of respect and authority, and that's never really happened, or has it? And is this final scene a culminating experience of that, right? Finally seeing Sonny's life in the man that he is, right? Or the man that he's become here. And we're seeing it kind of unfold on stage. But beautiful way to describe Sonny here at the end, right? He is royalty. Remember we saw this, a little foreshadowing when he responded to his brother, you don't have to listen to the music I like. And he said it with dignity. So I think we saw early glimpses of this dignified stature, right, of Sonny here at the end. Right. Now we all have one of these kind of guys in our lives, one of these kinds of people. And there's this guy that plays the drums in Sonny's little troupe here, and he's a cheerful looking man built close to the ground. And I think the idea of being close to the ground means he's of this earth, which means he's of the earth and its ruinous temptations, whether it be drugs, sex. Go read Romeo and Juliet. It seems to allude to all of these things that take us away from that kind of devotion, right, to God, etc., or just a better life, you could say. So he's a reflection of that, and he's the perfect character to spill the beans on Sonny and all of the, despicable behaviors of Sonny, and that's exactly what he's doing. We all might have somebody like this in our lives. I have a son who loves to, rat out all kinds of people, right, the bad things that they're doing, right, and remind us of these things. So we have one of these in our house. He's wonderful. He's a wonderful little boy. But I think that's the idea. We're not perfect, right? And it's an expression of that. You get some similes here, right? With the teeth gleaming like a lighthouse, the beginning of an earthquake, right? Interesting. I won't say too much on that. And we move on. Creole sits, the narrator, in a corner all by himself, all right? They don't want to step in the middle of that light. Remember the uncle who stepped into the moonlight and he was struck by the car of white people. That center stage, that spotlight in the middle of the stage, they are all reluctant to go into it because I think it represents the dangers of life. Ironically, right, because we talk about that idea of darkness. But here, we talk about the moonlight. Moonlight gets a very negative association. Biblically, the moon usually gets a pretty negative association. So that could be different, right? But they're afraid of this spot. It reminds me of the middle of the road, right? And what happened after that white car started coming down, the car full of white guys started coming down the road. Creole sits Sonny down ceremoniously, right? In this ceremonious way, extremely ceremonious. That's where we start to take on a kind of a religious feel within this scene, all right? The light takes on an indigo. That's going to be a mix of purple and blue. Purple is royalty. And I think we are made royal through our own individual experiences, whatever those might be, right? It's what makes us who we are. It's what we have to live through, suffer through, and prevail through, right? Or at least find some kind of steady beat that can keep us moving day by day, right, in some kind of direction. But that could be the royalty that we see here, right? That we all have stories, we all have these experiences. There's a lot of profound, I guess you could say, reflection on the experience by the narrator. He says, and his triumph, speaking to Sonny's triumph up on stage, when he triumphs is ours. So it's this collective triumph. We get some personification of the musical instruments up on stage. It starts with Creole having a dialogue with Sonny, and that reminds us of the dialogue that he tried to have with his older brother about drug use, about what he wanted to be growing up, as he got older, being a jazz musician. So again, it should be a real clear reminder of those conversations that they had, right? And we're left with a really important simile, which is that there's a difference between drowning and staying out in the deep water, right? Deep water, being out there treading, all the scissor kicking that you have to do, that is the day-by-day struggle to stay clean. That is the day-by-day struggle to not let racial injustice eat us alive, perhaps, in terms of our consciousness, right, and how we feel about the world. That could be another way of looking at it. Especially with this idea of Creole and the mixture of white and black here that he represents in some way. He's a dark black man, right? Don't get me wrong, that's the way he's described, but the name itself could reflect this idea of coming together, right? So it could be trying to struggle through all of these things, but he wants him to come out. He wants him to be able to do this on his own. And I think it's not just for Sonny, it's probably for all the bandmates, but maybe Sonny takes on a special importance here, right? Because maybe he's younger, maybe he does reflect a kind of potential, he needs this kind of assistance, right? Talking a lot about the instruments, the power that they allow us to have in terms of getting our own lives across to others. More personification of the musical instruments. The piano stammered, right? This is Sonny trying to play the piano, and again, it's reflective of how he lived his life, perhaps with drug addiction, or how he tries to talk about these things with his brother. He stammers, he stops, he pulls back, right? He doesn't know how to describe it. He does it a different way, right? Could reflect his life in general. The dry, low black man said something awful on the drums. Yeah, because that's what that man does. He shares the despicable aspects of life and our lives in general, right? That's what he does. There is something awful on the drums. It's called this world. It's called this planet, all right? And Creole answers, and the drums talk back. It's a conversation about these unfortunate things within the world, who we are as people, what we've become. Then the horn insisted. All personified language here. Horns don't insist, people insist. And it speaks to a certain kind of will and hope. And it's something sweet and high and slightly detached. Well, of course, hope usually is detached. The reality will always speak to the idea of there always being trouble and there always being these difficult spots in life, maybe prolonged difficult times in our lives. So the music and the sentiments of hope have to be detached from the reality, or we might not even have any to begin with, right? These are the things that keep us going forward. And with this, Sonny's brought into the fold here of this family. And that's such a powerful word to get at the end of the story, because that's what the narrator's chasing. He wants to feel like brothers again. He wants to be there to play that role and to have that connection with his younger brother. But I don't feel bad about this family, with Creole at the lead and these other guys he's surrounded by, which seems to be described as a routine that Sonny's taken on at this point in his life. And I feel like we get this trembling. It's never going to stop. Relapse can always happen, right? It could happen at any moment. However, he's maintaining a steady beat here at the end of the story, and I think that's the most hopeful thing that we end with, right? As we get closer and closer here. A couple more things to say. Creole reminded everybody we're playing the blues, right? That's what we're playing here, which is nice and directly put. Profound narrative statements we find here, thematic statements. And he says, for while the tale of how we suffer and how we are delighted and how we may triumph is never new, it always must be heard. From generation to generation, race to race, or just as a people in general, the challenges, the difficulties, the pain and suffering of our lives will change shape and form, right? They will change. But our need to express these things and tell it through stories and music will never end, right? We owe it to ourselves. We owe it to the people that will come after us, right? We owe it to them and to the people that precede us, because they've left those sentiments with us as well. Very good. And looking at this a little bit more, closely this time around, Creole, it says, he made the little black man on the drums. That's the guy sharing all the awful things. And the bright brown man on the horn. No, he says he made the little black man on the drums know it, and the bright brown man on the horn. So he's speaking to both sides. He's speaking to the despondent, those who find this objective perspective on reality. There's no getting away. There's no getting around the difficult parts. But the insistence on that sweet high horn, he's understanding the hope as well. He's bringing it all together here, which is very nice to see, right? We can, all of this leads the narrator to consider, we can cease lamenting. It makes us think immediately, what does the narrator lament the most, even more than Sonny? Probably the loss of grace. And it's one of those unspoken conflicts in the story. We get a little bit about it, he opens up a little bit, but then there's nothing, right? And maybe we need to stop lamenting, right? We have to kind of move forward here. And another reference to Zion here at the end here, right? The ship that will carry us to salvation. The importance of parents, another theme here to be reminded of at the end. The importance of parents and guardians in helping to translate a sense of experience to their young. As it says here, he had made it his, that long line of which we knew only mama and daddy. That's beautiful, We read about history in the history books. We have maybe some vague connections to it. But the only real sense comes from our parents and what they impart to us and what we observe as children, right? How important it is. Our parents here. That's really the only set of experiences we can base a lot of our understanding of life on before we inevitably have our own, is our parents, right? And how important that is. This brings him to think about his little girl again, and he felt Isabel's tears again. Man, that's tough. He's almost more concerned with Isabel's sadness on the loss of grace than he is his own. Because I'll tell you, to see other people grieve is so hard. It's so hard, right? So it's all coming to him, but maybe this is the stuff that he's really subdued. This is the kind of the topics, the things he doesn't want to think about, and it's coming back to him because maybe his story matters, right? Thinking about his own grief makes him think about Sonny's, and maybe it's this kind of mutual relationship. Creole and Sonny let out their breath. They're both soaking wet. It could be, maybe it's a reach, a kind of baptism of some kind. And lastly, we are left with the bar tender bringing Sonny a scotch and milk. This is from the older brother. He says, take him up a scotch and a milk. And I think it represents two worlds that will forever collide as long as we are human beings. That of the adult and luring world, right? All of the temptations and vices and dangers that loom outside that living room window that is represented by the darkness, right? That's the scotch, that's the alcohol. The milk there is going to be the child, the world of the child and the nurturing and the protected. And the most difficult time in our lives perhaps is coming out of one and entering into the other. And then going through that and then maybe even having to reflect on how that whole experience went, which I think is essentially the kind of trajectory of what we get in Sonny's Blues, which is a very long, right, kind of story that goes back and forth here in terms of time. So we got both things, both worlds right on the top of this piano of all things, which represents the importance of music. This drink right on the top there. And he gives the narrator a nod of approval. Thank you for the drink. And then the last image is very, let's even say, unsettling. The drink, right? You think about the meniscus there, the liquid. It glowed and shook above my brother's head like the very cup of trembling. Weird, awkward description here, right? Awkward phrasing even, the very cup of trembling. And I don't think, it almost sounds like it could be a biblical reference, but I don't think it is. I think I tried looking that up and it wasn't. But it just means the cup of trembling, which represents this unsteadiness that will forever loom above his head, which is to say above his life. And that should remind us of a couple things here, right? The relapse on drugs that he made his brother aware of. It can happen anytime. There's the trembling. Right? It can happen at any time. And music is kind of the foundation in which this is now resting on. Only music can keep this kind of steadiness, right? And keep this from kind of collapsing. It's the unwavering commotion of our lives, like a drum with a patterned rhythm. We must press and continue on while sharing our stories, right? But I think it reminds us of the fact that in a way, as the story ends, ironically, it doesn't end in terms of what's going to have to be Sonny's steady prevalence, right, over this drug addiction, day by day, but now with maybe his brother by his side, camped out in the corner, reflecting on his own concerns. Man, it really does seem like a very happy ending, at least for the time being here, right? I know this was a long lecture. It's also a very long story. I hope you enjoyed it, and I really encourage you to read more Baldwin in the future. Thank you.